Well, good evening. My name is Chris McCullough, and I'm Director of Evangelization and Faith Formation here at the Cathedral. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Lading to be with us this evening. I want to introduce him and tell you a little bit about Dr. Lading before we begin. He has degrees from Swarthmore College, from the University of Georgia, and has done his postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1993. He is currently a professor of philosophy at Loyola University, right here in Baltimore, and has done many things within the world of psychology. He's been director of clinical training for the doctoral program in clinical psychology at Loyola. He has co-edited and co-authored 6 books in the areas of stress and post-traumatic stress. He's an instructor with the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. And he also contributes to an international journal of emergency medical health. He has also been active in consulting with FEMA, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms, the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, and he has been active in assisting the U.S. Department of State. He's also consulted in clinical interventions and helped out in the aftermath of September 11th. So he comes with much experience in dealing with stress and processing stress. And so he is here tonight to help us in this time of the coronavirus to talk about stress and its impact on us and ways that we can manage it. Since we are live and live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, I will be monitoring the comments, and so if you have any questions that come up at this as he talks, please type your questions or comments in, and I can direct them to Dr. Lading to have him answer those. So thank you for being with us, and without further ado, I welcome Dr. Lading.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to ask you at some point to keep me on track with time or whatever. We'll know how we're doing. But thank you for the introduction. I'm honored to be here, but I know it's under circumstances that are anything but auspicious. So I do want to convey and hope that everybody remains safe. What I'd like to do tonight is not necessarily talk specifically about the virus. I want to talk about the virus in the sense of the psychological component to it and what we can do about that. And let me just, my style of doing any of the work that I do is to simply share with you what I've been able to learn over the years, whether it's from writing or teaching, but I just want to share. And right now we're dealing with a toxin. We're dealing with a virus, we're dealing with something that is unknown, that we haven't dealt with before. And when that toxin enters the mind, in a sense, and when we think about stress as a toxin, and the best antidote sometimes for that toxin is to give people good information, and that's what I want to be able to share with you. I want to share with you some anecdotes. I want to share with you some information, some studies. I don't want to get overly clinical with this, but I want you to get a sense of what we can do and why. And I think that, to me, the antidote to the stress toxin sometimes is to provide some good information. One of the things that Chris had mentioned is that I've spent time with FEMA. And I've been doing consulting work with them for probably more than 25 years. Gosh, it seems that long, maybe not quite that long, but it's probably been more than 20 years. And one of the things that we do with FEMA is we would travel to large events in preparation for large events. And I had the opportunity to go to the preparation of the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. And this was pre-9/11. And what was interesting is I had the opportunity at that time to review the municipal plan. So we were working with the organizers for the Winter Olympics, and we were working with the people that were in Salt Lake City. And what was interesting is after having the opportunity to look at the municipal plan, and it was my turn to address the audience, I just mentioned to them, I said, you have a really good plan for what you're going to do for the florid signs and symptoms of distress. In other words, they had a plan to evacuate the building, they had a plan to put out the fires, but my question to them is, I said, if something like this were to occur, I said, what do you have in place for the most salient symptoms? And what I meant by that is the most salient symptoms in the aftermath of a critical incident are often the psychological symptoms. And the psychological symptoms can outnumber physical symptoms anywhere from 4 to 5, some estimates are 50 to 1. And to give you an example of this, it was in 1995 in March. So it's hard to imagine that it's been this long that this occurred, 25 years. But it happened in Japan. And it was a doomsday cult, the Aum Shinrikyo cult. And what they did is they released sarin gas, if anybody remembers this, on a crowded Tokyo subway at 9 a.m. in the morning. And they were fully anticipating that there were going to be mass casualties. But what happened is that somehow it was, the way it was diluted or whatever had happened, because what they did is they had placed the bags and they were designed to pierce the bags with umbrella tips right at 9 a.m. But it didn't go off as planned, fortunately, but still 12 people died from cardiopulmonary arrest. And something that's worth noting, it was 3 hours before they could identify what the substance was. So you can imagine what was happening in that 3-hour block of time. There was going to be mass hysteria. But what was interesting is that as a result of this, they had 5,500 people went to hospitals, and 1,000 of them were admitted. So the suggestion is there were about 4 times the number of people who went to hospitals but did not necessarily have exposure to sarin gas. But what they did have is fear. And what they did have are some of the signs of stress. If you think about this, one of the classic symptoms of somebody having a panic attack are consistent with the respiratory type of symptoms that people were experiencing when exposed to the sarin. So shortness of breath, not being able to breathe would be also a sign of a panic attack. And so people misinterpreted those signs and symptoms that they had been exposed to the sarin. So you can imagine how this would translate to what we're dealing with now, that people are feeling and experiencing that sense of discomfort where you go out at all. And let's say you're just going to the grocery store and we're so concerned now about touching anything or being around something. And let's say you go home at night and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I feel a tightness in my chest, or I feel something. You know, how are we interpreting that? And I think people, it's not unusual that they would have these types of interpretations. If I can, I'll just give you 2 more examples of this notion of what is often referred to as the iceberg effect when it comes to critical incidents, that the psychological symptoms often outnumber the physical symptoms. If you remember, if anybody remembers the first Gulf War, back in 1991, and in preparation for the Gulf War, and this is when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the Iraqi government had made very serious threats that they were going to launch these Scud missiles with potentially chemical weapons into Israel. So in anticipation of this, the entire population of Israel, they were given gas masks, and they were taught how to use the gas masks. And then what they were also given, in case they had been exposed to a biochemical weapon, that they were also given atropine. Atropine would be an antidote for this exposure. Well, it was about a month that there were about 38 missiles launched in about a month's period of time. Fortunately, none of them contained chemical weapons. However, they had 2 people who died, you know, and it's always tragic, but they died from falling debris. But what I wanted to share with you, and this is sort of the impact that stress can have and not necessarily thinking clearly, is that they had 11 people die. 7 died because they didn't open the filter on the gas mask. They weren't thinking clearly. They were afraid. And you had 4 people die from heart attacks. So you could make a pretty reasonable argument that 5 times the number of people passed away from fear than from the actual exposure to the weapons, the bombings. And something also interesting is 230 people needlessly injected themselves with the atropine because, again, they were afraid. And when you're afraid, one of the things that happens is you don't think necessarily clearly. There's a term for this called cortical inhibition. And it's a sort of a fancy term which basically means when you get stressed out, you lose IQ points. You think more emotionally, and you're not necessarily thinking from the front part of your brain where you do most of your problem solving. And as a result of this, when people get afraid, when people get worried, and I saw some of this on Monday when the governor decided to do the lockdown. And I have a daughter, and she called me, and she was just really uncertain about what this meant. Does this mean I have to be somewhere by 8 o'clock tonight and I can't go somewhere else? She's living with roommates, and they weren't clear about what they needed to do and how they were going to respond. And I tried to calm her down, and part of the way I was doing that is saying, right now it's hard. No, it's people are thinking from and reacting from their emotions and from their heart as compared to from their head. And this can happen when people get stressed out, when there's critical incidents, when there are crises, that people who are typically people who lead with their heads, they start to lead with their hearts. And I think that what we want to do to try to help people in that situation is we are all a combination of head and heart. And my suggestion would be just try to recognize where that person happens to be. If they're somebody who is currently leading from their head, if they're more cognitively focused, if they're more thinking about something, what they're looking for from you would be good information. Give them the facts. Tell them what they need to know. Somebody who is more affectively based or more emotionally based, what they're looking for would be support. And don't try to mix them up too much, because if you try to give a lot of support for somebody who's looking for information, they're going to say, yeah, I know it's going to be okay. Tell me what I need to do. Conversely, if you try to give too much information for somebody who's looking for support, they're going to say, look, you're overwhelming me. Just tell me it's going to be okay. And so you can meet people where they happen to be. I want to mention just one other bit of information, and something that a study that I was involved in about the notion of a psychological contagion. Can fear spread? And we are certainly seeing and experiencing that in the country right now. And a lot of it is warranted as far as our reactions, but the notion of fear being able to spread. This came after September 11th. And prior to 9/11, I had done some work with American Airlines flight attendants. And so after 9/11, they approached me and they said, Jeff, we in no way belittle the heroism of the New York City firefighters, the New York City police officers, all the first responders. But they noted, they said, but we are the ones that are getting on the weapon of mass destruction. And, and we're afraid. And I went to Dallas and I worked with union reps from about 68 different bases. And while we were there, I had a chance to talk to the president of the union. And I asked him, because he said, our people are really responding in a really, difficult way. They're really experiencing some trepidation about getting on a plane. And I certainly empathized with this. And I said, is there any way that we can assess them? Is there any way that we can get some information? Because part of it was that that the flight attendants were concerned that people at corporate headquarters were not going to necessarily be sensitive to what they were experiencing. So what we were able to do is we were able to put in questionnaires. The Association of Professional Flight Attendants, they had a periodical that went out to 26,000 flight attendants. So we were able to put questionnaires in there to assess stress, particularly probable post-traumatic stress disorder. And we assessed them about 8 months after the incident had occurred. Now, what was interesting is that we got about more than 2,000 responses back, and the 2,000 responses were very consistent with the demographics of the entire 26,000. But what was interesting is we decided to take a look and compare flight attendants that flew out of either Boston, New York, or DC. And I should note that those that flew out of Boston, New York, and DC were more than twice as likely to have known someone who perished on 9/11. And just to put this in perspective, the plane that hit the North Tower at 9/11 was an American Airlines flight. The plane that struck the Pentagon was an American Airlines flight. There was Flight 587, the flight that left on November 12th, that was heading to Santo Domingo, and it just was unfortunate that it crashed. But this was also an American Airlines flight. And then if anybody remembers the Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, he was also on an American Airlines flight. So collectively, they had experienced a tremendous amount. But the flight attendants that flew out of Boston, New York, or DC were more than 2 times as likely to have known someone who perished. And so we compared the folks from Boston, New York, and DC with people from Los Angeles and San Francisco, as far away as possible, flight attendants from those bases. And what we found, I think, speaks to what we're experiencing in our country today is when I talk and I'm giving a presentation and I ask people, who do you think had more probable PTSD? And more often than not, people would say, well, I would imagine the people that flew from the East Coast because they were more directly involved and they knew more people. Well, what we found is that there was no difference. There was no difference between those that flew from the West Coast and those that flew out of the East Coast. And their level of probable post-traumatic stress disorder was twice as high as as what you would see in a lifetime prevalence, meaning that they had an incredibly high rate of this. And what it suggested to us, because what we heard from the people who were the West Coast flight attendants, is they said that we could be next. We could be next. And so that notion of fear spreading, and this is what we're experiencing now. We're hearing from Governor Hogan, for example, that Maryland and DC and Virginia could be where New York is right now. And so that fear spreading, and you're seeing people respond to this. And I'm going to talk in a bit more about what we can do. But what I want to try to convey is this notion of normalizing in some ways that this, from a psychological perspective, is how people will respond. I want to also mention that when you think about stress and think about how it reacts and how we react to it, the one key in some of this is how we interpret things. A stress response typically requires an interpretation before we experience stress. And in essence, there are 2 different kinds of stressors. There are what are known as biogenic stressors. These are stressors that don't require an interpretation. They're stressors in and of themselves. Something, for example, like caffeine. Something, for example, like really cold water. You don't have to interpret that. Your body will just respond to it, and in turn, you will experience that stress response. However, most of the stress that we experience in our lives requires an interpretation. They're known as psychosocial stressors. And so we need to interpret them in some way. And why I think this is so relevant and so important in a time like now is, I was watching a TED Talk from a colleague, Kelly McConigal, and she was talking about a study that was done with 30,000 adults, and it was done over an 8-year period of time. And what was interesting is the study asked people, how stressed are you? Okay, so they could rate how stressed they were. But then they also asked if they thought that the stress was harmful. And what they found is that looking at these folks over time, that it was not necessarily how much stress they perceived. What mattered was whether or not they thought it was bad. And those that thought it was bad and those that thought it was harmful, the study estimated that about 20,000 deaths a year occur in this country from thinking that stress is bad for you, because they followed these people over time and could look at mortality rates. And so it's really interesting, this notion of how you think, so shall you feel. And it reminds me of the purpose of stress. What is the purpose of stress? Stress is meant to help us. It's to protect us. We experience and have this acute stress reaction in an effort to protect us. So that is why, for example, our heart beats faster. That is why our pupils dilate, or why, we feel this sense of our mouth getting dry. We break it in a cold sweat. All of these are characteristics because our body is trying to protect us. It's an evolutionary thing that it's designed to do. So if at times we can think that, okay, if I'm feeling a little stressed out, if I'm feeling this sort of anxiety and angst, that it's not meant to harm me, it's actually meant to somehow try to help me. Where stress becomes a challenge, and this is part of what we're experiencing now, it's prolonged stress that is the problem. The stress response, the human stress response, was meant to help us when we were dealing with high threat type of situations, if we were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger or something like this. But our stress now is typically more chronic, and what we're dealing with, certainly with the coronavirus, is exceedingly chronic. So this can take its toll on us. There is a fancy term that I often toss around. I'll just give it to you. It's called excitatory neurotoxicity. And in essence, what that means is our bodies are working, and our mind and our body are working together to provide chemicals to keep us aroused, to keep us alert, to keep us dealing with all the stress that we're experiencing. But what I will tell people is it takes energy to produce these chemicals. It requires energy to make these chemicals happen. And what happens is you have to burn these chemicals up. And one of the best ways to help burn these chemicals up is through exercise. And it's so interesting because one of the things that will happen is when we get stressed out, is we give up exercising. And I was pleased to hear, even with the lockdown, that they are, encouraging people to exercise, and to exercise at a safe distance. If you are somebody who exercises, even if you're somebody who doesn't exercise, I really could not emphasize more highly to get outside, to practice the physical distancing, but to maintain the exercise, because it is so incredibly helpful. There's a book called Brain Rules by a guy by the name of John Medina. And what he suggests is that if pharmaceutical companies could come out with a drug that could do for us what exercise does, it would be the most important drug discovered in the past 100 years. Because exercise helps with mood, it helps with digestion, it helps with skin, it helps with just so many different aspects of what we do. So keep that in mind when you are dealing now with some of what we're going through. Something else that I would note for you, and again, to me, when it comes to the psychological, the emotional piece, one of the antidotes to the toxin is good information. Well, I just think that it's worth noting that our brain is wired for greater sensitivity to unpleasant news than it is wired to positive news. And the brain is prone to worry. The brain is designed to worry, and it's prone to negative news. And this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we have to protect ourselves, we want to know if something is hunting us, if we need to be aware of something so we can respond. And so the way that I often conceptualize this is that the brain acts like Teflon for positive experiences, but often like Velcro for negative experiences. So right now, folks, we are dealing with so much sticking to our brains that can be considered, in a sense, like Velcro. And so I think if we're just aware of this and just can give ourselves permission to say, that's my brain doing what it is designed to do, but let me try to put and think about something that can be positive on this as well. And I know that it's getting more challenging sometimes, and I, to share with you, for me as well, that, I want to know what is going on, but you can see within the media and through the news that people at times just feel inundated with the worry. They feel inundated with the lack of positives. And I think that the media sources are trying to balance some of that out. We've all heard of this notion of the fight or flight response. And that was developed by a guy by the name of Walter Cannon. And again, it makes it, again, sound like the stress response isn't helpful when you talk about fight or flight or whatever. But I would offer to you something that is a more recent development. And here's just something that most of the research, when people talk about a fight or flight reaction or a fight or flight response, most of the studies that assess this, whether Walter Cannon, Hans Selye, the luminaries that looked at the stress response, most of the studies were done with men. In about 2006, there was a woman named Shelley Taylor, and she came up with a different approach to this notion of the stress response. And what she did is she said, in addition to the fight or flight reaction, she suggested that there is a separate stress reaction that she called tend and befriend. In other words, gather and befriend and be around other people and be friendly. And she suggested and looked at this more for women. It occurs in men as well, but she was able and looked and assessed this in women. And what is so interesting about this is she looked at a particular hormone called oxytocin. And some of you, if you're listening in, you think, wait a second, where have I heard about oxytocin? Oxytocin is a chemical that mothers will release to increase bonding with infants. It's considered, and people have often referred to it as like the cuddle hormone. But what is interesting about oxytocin is that it is a stress hormone. But what it does, and I think it's so incredibly relevant, I'm leading to where I want to take our talk here tonight, but it is a stress hormone. But part of what it will do is it helps to relax. It helps blood vessels relax during stress. Oxytocin is a natural anti-inflammatory. Okay? It also, what it will do is it helps the heart cells regenerate and heal from stress. It helps us recover faster from stress. It is a built-in mechanism to foster resilience. And just to give you an interesting study about this, and again, one of the things, and it's interesting too, that when you hear people now and what we're working with and what we're doing, people are so happy to have pets. pets with them and finding such comfort in their pets and spending more time with their pets. And what is really interesting about this, there was a study, fascinating study, where they trained, and they were able to train dogs to be able to go into a PET scan so they could get images of their brain and see what was going on in the brain. And they put earmuffs on them because it's loud in there, and they were able to train these dogs. And what was really quite interesting is that while the dogs were in this tube, what they did is they presented dogs with sweat. And they presented dogs with sweat from their owner and then sweat from somebody else. And what was so interesting is that when they were presented, the dogs, with sweat from their owner, their brain lit up in these areas that were releasing oxytocin and dopamine and certain chemicals that made them feel better. And what is so interesting about this, and the thought is that when we are around our pets as well, we release oxytocin. And it was interesting because one of the takeaway messages was, does my dog or does my pet really love me? Or is it just looking for food? Well, in this instance, when your dog or, and cat, I mean, I think cats are, but in the study that was done with dogs, but when they make that eye contact with you, if you've ever, you're up and you're just kind of staring in your eyeball to eyeball with your dog, the thought is that they are releasing oxytocin. And you are as well. They're hugging you with their eyes. And there is something that becomes so soothing about this. So oxytocin is considered to facilitate resilience. But that resilience is human connection. So obviously you can have that connection with your dog, but oxytocin also, it is meant and it is designed to help and to foster human contact. So let's put this in perspective now about what we're dealing with. Looking for positive contact with others, looking for support from someone else. And it's interesting because I've read recently, and I would absolutely concur with this, is that we're calling what we're doing now and what we're being asked to do as social distancing. I would offer to you, and I agree with others that have suggested this, we should be calling it physical distancing. We should not be calling it social distancing. If anything, what we should be doing is to foster and try to work on maintaining through all of this social contacts. Because let's face it, physical distancing is great for dealing with a virus, but loneliness, if that's what people are experiencing, is not great for recovering from the virus. And so what we should be and what we want to be able to do is to provide that sense of connection with others. Loneliness and isolation are related to higher blood pressure. It also weakens our immune system. And it's interesting, and boy, you want to talk about something that's related to what we're dealing with now with this virus, is that loneliness also affects, and it has, an antiviral response. Our antiviral response is suppressed when we're lonely. All right, so apparently what happens is our bodies think that it doesn't need to worry about viruses when we're not around people. That makes sense. From an evolutionary perspective, there's that antiviral response to say, okay, well, I don't need to be activated. I'm not around anybody. But as you can see, even more so now, that we need to bolster this response. We don't want to suppress it. We want it bolstered. And the thought is, and what we can do about this, is to be able to give somebody a supportive phone call, be an empathetic ear to somebody else. Any form of an expression of caring. And we've seen instances of this in some places. I saw it on the news last week, and it was really encouraging to see the community in Annapolis where they go out and they say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And it's just, it's all within a safe distance, but people are just getting together. They're waving to each other. They're asking people what they need. And all of this can help foster this sense of connection with others, and it helps to foster the oxytocin when you have these positive contacts. And so, again, whatever can be done in that regard, and I know that we're limited in some of this right now, but it doesn't necessarily have to be within a physical distance that is going to be challenging for what the restrictions are. But what can you do to reach out and just make that phone call to somebody you haven't spoken with for a while? Text messages, happy hours online, whatever it might be to foster some of this. And all of these things can help bolster immune function on a molecular level. This is what we need right now. And whether it's the recipient or the giver, it's good for you. It really is good for you. And so that to me is and I want to give people the reason why. Again, I was, throughout my career, I've been just curious regarding why do people do certain things? Why does that make sense? Why is it that, people now, and again, the outpouring of support that you will often see in the aftermath of critical incidents and crisis situations, well, some of that it's the release of oxytocin. People will feel better. Yeah, Chris?
I do have one question. I have a question saying, any tips for when you want to be social but are screened out? Because now we're working from home and on our screens all day. That means the last thing you want to do is on another Zoom meeting. And it's just sometimes too much. So do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, boy, and I hear this just and I'll address that question, but I'm an instructor in psychology at Loyola at the university, and and all the classes, all the courses now are online, and students are often saying, "Oh my gosh, we're spending 6 hours a day sometimes just Zooming and on the screen." And so, yeah, I get it that it can be just excessive, and we get quote unquote screened out. But maybe just a phone call. Maybe if there's a way to, stay and sort of have that social distancing where there's another possible way to do it in a neighborhood like this people are, where they're just checking in with each other and doing it at a safe distance and being able to do that. And, I can appreciate that, because one of the things that we encourage people to do is to limit sort of the screen time as a way to reduce some of the stress. It certainly is a challenge right now. And I think that, for some people, if you're able to, and I've seen people do, they're exercising together at a distance. They're walking, but they are walking away from each other, but they're able to talk and to communicate. And hopefully, that will sort of help as we are waiting to see what the next step is in some of this. And I wish I could be more, give even more than that, but it is the challenge, but being able to do that.
I don't know if people will hear me, but one example I saw was there was a large open field. I was taking a walk on Friday. There was a bunch of guys, young guys. They had a happy hour. There was this huge ring of guys, and they were each stationed apart from each other, and they each had their own cooler. They were having an outdoor happy hour.
If there's, again, I think, and one thing that we know about people, they're very resourceful, and they will do this. Something else I want to suggest is when I do strategic planning for people in the aftermath of crisis situations, there are 3 things that people want, and it's really quite interesting because the first thing that people look for is social cohesion. They want to be a part of something. The second piece is that they want good information. Now, and the third piece is an action plan. Now, you can see how challenging this virus is because it's not allowing and it doesn't foster social cohesion the way that we're accustomed. Again, I'm at Loyola University, and I'll take you back to what happened on 9/11, and they have mass every day on campus. And it's, reasonably well attended, but on that particular day, you couldn't fit everybody into the chapel because of this notion of social cohesion. People wanted to be a part of something. And people want good information. They want accurate information. That I would offer to you as much as anything that we're dealing with right now is that the information keeps changing. And that to us is just so challenging. There is a theory in psychology by a woman named Ellen Langer, and this notion of a perception of control. We want to believe and have a perception of control. Even if it's not necessarily something that is always valid, we want to perceive that we have some control over situations and what we're doing. And when we are receiving information that keeps changing, our perception, our notion of what we can control is changing along with it. And that, I would offer, is something that is enhancing the current stress that we're experiencing. Because remember, the human stress response was meant to be something short-lived. Now we're dealing with something that is chronic. You keep tapping into this. There's a term called allostatic load. In other words, you keep tapping into this stress response, and it does take an effect over time. And I think that people, and we're getting, the best information that we can get, but we have to deal with the fact that it keeps changing. And even the action plan and what we're being expected to do keeps changing. We do much better. And when I say we, I mean as just a species, human beings do much better when we are given sort of, here's the information, here's what you need to do, and then here's, how it's going to end. If we knew that by the end of, by the end of April, if this was going to be done, we collectively would just be, okay, we can do this. But I would offer that part of what is creating the ongoing stress is it going to be over? Is it going to change again? How is that going to affect us? What is it that we're then going to be expected to do? And it's that long-term effect. And I would offer to you as well that part of this is that we're out of our routine, we're out of the structure. And when we miss normalcy, that affects us as well. I've encouraged my students to maintain sort of, get up like you're going to school, get dressed at times like you're going to go to class, keep the routine as much as possible, because what will happen is that it's just, you feel like, why should I worry as much about this? Why should I care as much about this? And, and I've heard, different terms for this, and it was interesting. I don't know, Chris, if you've heard this one or not, but people have called it the quarantine 15. Have you heard this one? Right? That, that people are gaining weight or whatever because they're just eating, and there's less to do, and you're not exercising as much, and it's just, and eating in response to chronic stress is not unusual anyway. You crave sort of sweetness in all of this. So, these are the types of things that we want to be able to recognize. If I could, I'd like to mention, because I found in my travels, one of the most compelling, interesting things that happened to me was going to New York after 9/11 and working with the Secret Service. And just to let you know, what had happened is that Secret Service headquarters was in New York, Building 7. It collapsed. And they had an agent. An agent lost his life as a result of this. There were about 25 support staff who happened to be in the building at the time, mostly women, who now found their way on the streets of New York. And they were covered in debris. I mean, it was just really quite a scene. By the time I arrived to New York, Secret Service headquarters was now a vacant terminal of JFK Airport. And they had done an amazing job running wires, and it was a sophisticated operation, doing what they needed to do. Well, they asked me if I would be willing to sit and to work with the people who were in the building at the time that it collapsed. And again, mostly women who were the support staff, and I certainly and gladly said yes. Now, what was so interesting to me, and I think it speaks to what we are trying to do in the midst of this unbelievable time that we're living in, And we have to figure out a way to somehow try to be able to do this. But as I'm talking with these participants and I'm looking around and I ask them, so, tell me who you are, what your role was, what happened. And it was so interesting. There's about, as I mentioned, maybe more than 20 people in the room. And one woman pointed to another across from her and she said, well, you remember what we did? There we were covered in debris, we were covered in, the ash, and it was all of this going on. But they said, you remember when we saw each other? And she goes, oh, I absolutely remember. And she said, do you remember what we did? And she goes, absolutely. And what they did is they saw each other and they locked arms together. And they started walking arm in arm. And they saw someone else they knew. And they described a human chain of 18 people walking arm in arm. And what they did is there they were, and that's social cohesion, right? That is social cohesion. They walked to a vacant lot next to the building where they were, and they exchanged information at this time. If you remember, watches were not working. So, cell phones weren't working, but watches, right? If you had a watch, if you didn't, cell phones, so you didn't know, what time it was, you couldn't make communication, but if you had a watch. So they came up with an action plan. And what they decided to do is they said, well, half of us will stay here and the other half will go and look for people that we can't account for, and we'll meet back here in 30 minutes. And so they came up with an action plan. And what just was remarkable to me is that in the midst of this is strategically what people did. They formed a sense of social cohesion. They exchanged information, and they came up with an action plan. And that's what I would encourage people to do on a regular basis. What can you do to foster a form of social cohesion? What can you do to keep people informed? And sometimes the information, you got to temper some of this, because right now it can be so much. But what is your action plan? And part of that action plan is, what can we do to help foster something that's going to make us feel better, something that's going to help us do a little bit better? And again, whether that is doing something online, and I know that, you're trying to stay away from screen time, but if you maybe you do meditation, or maybe, you do yoga, or whatever it might be. Are there ways to somehow foster that in such a way that helps you? And I tell you, one of the things that I will always ask somebody when I'm working and I'm doing crisis intervention work in the aftermath of a critical incident is, I will just simply ask people, what have you done in the past to get yourself through these challenging times? What has worked for you? What is something that you have done previously? And for some people, it's, I exercise, or I journal, I write. For some people, I do woodwork, or, I paint, whatever it might be. Maybe there's something that you haven't done for a while that you can revisit, something that will allow you to be able to put the balance in this. And one of the things that I listen for, and currently when I'm listening to the updates and some of what we're hearing about with the virus, is, again, to try to temper in some ways the information that we're getting, that, again, the brain is going to react to the worry. The brain is going to react to the lack and the negative information. It's going to react to that. And I think that if there's a way to help balance some of this, and I heard Dr. Fauci the other day say something that, and again, he was suggesting that there is going to be a surge, and because typically, to me, when you're hearing about what is happening overnight and there's more deaths involved, and look, and it's going up and they show the numbers, and, in some ways, what Dr. Fauci was suggesting is, this is part of what this is going to do. It is unfortunate, it is awful, but it is not unexpected given the virus, given what we're dealing with, and given that, this is something that we haven't seen before. And so I appreciated when he said, but if we continue to do what we're doing, that's where the hope is, and we're continuing to be able to see this. People want to feel as if they are a part of something and that what they're doing is helping to make a difference. And, and seeing the data, for example, on, the fevers going down or whatever it happens to be, I can be encouraged by that. We need some of that. We need the balance between what the brain is getting regarding the negative news. Yeah.
I'm going to grab the microphone just so that
Oh, sure.
So my question is, you were talking about information and managing it. I think there's some tension in just the information that's being given, that there is a disparity in that information, and certainly I think people are looking for facts and those people who will give facts. But I think even with that, there's some inherent stress that's caused by different responses from leadership. And even people's level of how they receive the instructions to social distance. And can you address that at all? Or?
Well, I think that some of what could be happening there, it goes back to, I think, that notion of, are people leading with their head or their heart? And I think there are times when people want to get the information, but if you are feeling somewhat emotional, that information can become overwhelming really quickly if you feel as if that's just too much, And I think that there are times where I think it's creating that balance from leadership and that's what I was alluding to about how do you provide information in such a way, but balance it. So to me, you're trying to meet those that are more cognitively oriented and those that are more affectively oriented, And so to me, it's like, okay, here are the numbers, here are the data, because certain people just want to know that. And it's tempered with, but here's what you need to know, This is part of it. It is going, we don't know where this is going, and to admit that. But given sort of the trajectory, given what we know from other countries, this is the course it is going to take. And then give an action plan. As long as you are able to maintain what you're doing, whatever, we should be okay. And I think that is the key, is to try to balance the head and the heart, if that makes sense. The cognition with the emotions. And that's not easy to do, because some people are going to hear the part that they want to hear. And if they hear the information and it's too much, then again, they can shut down. And I think there are some people who are really good at being able to create that balance. And I think that, what can happen, for example, with the information, if the information is not trusted, then that just leads to a whole different set of circumstances and problems if you don't feel that what you're getting is accurate, or it's not going to be accurate tomorrow, or whatever it happens to be. That, I think, particularly with what is happening here, I know that you and I talked before we started the presentation that people often describe it as on a football field, you keep moving the goalpost back, right? When you think you know what it is, and it keeps changing, and we don't like change. And it's really interesting. One of the best definitions that I've heard of regarding stress is change, period. And this is certainly changing the fabric and the core of who we are. And that makes it really difficult. So I'm wondering how we're doing with time.
We are at 7:54, just before 8 o'clock.
So. Okay, sure. Sure. Something that I will note as well is, more specifically about certain things that can help. For example, people are staying up later. right? They're out of a routine. The insomnia starts to happen as well. And one of the things that I have learned over the years of doing this is to give people and help people to sleep. Because sleep can be the great equalizer for everybody. And some of the considerations that I think about in helping people to sleep is, first of all, good sleep hygiene is as effective as any over-the-counter or even prescription types of medications, Ambien or anything like that. And so when people think about, well, what can I do to help with sleep? And again, one of the keys is sometimes a darkened room, right? Turn off the blue screens and try to sleep. Keeping a regular sleep-wake cycle. Something that I think about as well is, and I share this with people, is that when we are sleeping, in essence, part of what our bodies are doing, our bodies are cooling itself down. And one of the ways to help facilitate that cooling down process is sometimes to try to warm it up. It's like taking a pendulum and pulling it back to sort of enhance getting to the other side. And so, for example, one suggestion is grandma's rule, which drink warm milk, right? And people often think, well, it must be the tryptophan, which is a precursor of serotonin, which in turn affects melatonin. So it does, in a sense, help. But I would offer to you that it's warm, and you're warming your insides. And most of what we drink that is warm is caffeinated. So if you're able to drink something that is warm, that helps to warm the insides, that can be really helpful. Another thing that I encourage people to do is, so drink something warm. You can drink chamomile tea, whatever, but something warm, not caffeinated, about 20 minutes before you go to bed, and maybe 40 minutes before you go to bed, take a hot bath or a hot shower. So you're kind of warming the extremities, warming the outside, and then warming the inside. And by being able to do that, you can help facilitate this cooling down process. And something else that people often will ask, well, can I exercise or should I exercise before I go to bed? Doesn't that release adrenaline? Wouldn't that be an issue? The American Sleep Foundation did a study and found that for about 80% of people, being able to exercise before they go to bed does not interrupt their sleep. So for some people, that can help. Something else that I have found, and it's interesting that people will often, when they talk about difficulties getting to sleep because of stress, is that their mind is worrying. They're thinking about all the things they have to do the next day. And so they're racing, the mind's racing. And, it's interesting that, for a lot of people, they're like, well, distract yourself somehow or do whatever, but that can be really challenging. The old adage of counting sheep or something like that. Believe it or not, there was a study that was done comparing people who were insomniacs with counting sheep and then listening to soothing music or whatever, and the music was better. But here's something that I've encouraged people to do, and it's a form of meditation. And in the Western style that we have of meditation, it's often used as a way to enhance the relaxation response. And it often uses what is known as a focal device, something that we can pay attention to. And this is something that somebody taught me years ago. And it really is something that's not super sophisticated, but it can really make a difference. And so what I will tell people to do, if you're trying to sleep and your mind is racing, first of all, if you're not asleep in about 20 minutes, don't fight it. Get out of bed, go do something else. Read something that is, boring, do something else that will facilitate and help you get to sleep. But I've encouraged people to try this. And I'll tell them, I said, here's something you can try. With your mouth closed, what you can do is take your tongue and float your tongue in the center of your mouth. So in other words, don't let it touch the top or the bottom of your mouth. And if if anybody's out there listening and wants to try that, see what happens when you try to do it. You have to concentrate. You have to focus. And so if your mind starts to wander, we just encourage people, go back to that focal device. Go back again and again. And I tell you, it was interesting. I suggested that to somebody, and I was in D.C., and it was like 6 years later, somebody came up and said, you gave a talk one time and you suggested doing this and it really works. I said, well, I wasn't going to suggest it if I didn't believe it was going to work. But there is something to be said about, in that regard, helping people to sleep. Okay?
So I have another question. How can we help children? They are online with their schoolwork. Parents are trying to juggle working from home and helping educate their children. I was thinking the same thing. My wife was on a Zoom meeting in our home office, so I had to work at the kitchen counter. My daughter was there talking away, and I was about to go through the roof because I couldn't focus. So,
yeah, and I can just empathize with parents that are working with children and what you're trying to be able to do, because it certainly is a challenge. I go back to the notion of doing everything you can to try to keep and maintain the structure, and even to suggest that that they can be involved in this as well, to even sit down together and create sort of even a daily, weekly, calendar. Here's what we're going to do. From this time to this time, you're going to wake up, then you're going to, work on your assignment here, and then we can take a break, or we can go take a walk outside or whatever. But to have it sort of structured, and then we're going to, if we'll bake something at this time, or you can have a little screen time here, or do whatever. That I think that can go a long way. And I think that as far as, with younger children and the issues that they're having now is to try to be honest with them, but to put it in terms that they can understand, but to let them ask their questions. I think in those terms regarding how challenging that is, because they don't truly understand, and they're afraid, and they'll react to our fears and our responses as well. My work has always been done with adults, and I know that there are others that work specifically with children, and I think that it is, remarkable how resilient children can be. But I think that it really depends on listening, being able to provide structure, and being as honest as you possibly can with what's going on, and to let them know that it's okay to be, worried about this. It's okay to be afraid, and think about, in a sense, what can we do and how can we keep ourselves safe? It was interesting. I was somewhere the other day, and you could see that somebody had a picture on the side of their cubicle or whatever, and you could tell that it was drawn by a young child, and they had the virus, and they had it sort of being taken away, and it was just really sort of interesting. So, I'm a big fan of doing play as well, and art. Sometimes that if they want to convey something, if they want to help others as well, maybe they want, for kids to, what can we do to maybe send cards to people, or do something that might feel as if they're helping others because they want to do something, and to send get well cards, or to do whatever, or to let hospital workers know how much they're appreciated. Anything like that could be something that I think for a child, an ambitious child, or that would want to get involved and do something to kind of give back, or to help. And let's face it, we know again how well received that is, and so you can imagine if St. Joseph gets cards to the nursing staff, or from young kids. Oh my gosh, they love that, because it goes back to the oxytocin. Whether you're the giver or the receiver, it is helping, and it makes you feel like you're that social cohesion and a part of something, and there's a plan involved. And again, it's not meant to be prescriptive as far as you should do this, but it is certainly something that I think that you can think about, and certainly with children. And again, part of the difficulty with children as well is that the chronicity of this, and what do you do, and how do you break some of this up? But I would offer, and depending on their age and what seems appropriate, to have them involved in some of the scheduling that is done. What can they do to say, okay, on this day we're going to do this, or this is something to look forward to, or whatever it happens to be. Just some initial thoughts, and I rely on my colleagues who are much more, well versed at this. And if all else fails, I've often found, food coloring, what I mean? That goes a long way, whatever it might be, whether it's, you want green eggs, I'll give you green eggs, you want, whatever, if there's something that, can keep them sort of entertained and occupied, so it's fun. Let me think what else that I haven't had a chance to talk about. I mean, again, I think that the forms of relaxation that people can use, I think taking the time for that. Again, going back to this model that we have of the human stress response, it begins with an event. And from the event, there's an interpretation. And from the interpretation, what we have is what is known as a chance of affective integration, meaning that you start to experience some of the emotion, but you can rethink that. And I just want to emphasize how important it can be, our ability to think and to rethink. I remember seeing something from one of the hurricanes out in Florida. Maybe it was Hugo. It was years ago. And there was the camera crew that showed up the day after. And there's a woman, and she's out back, and she's surveying sort of the backyard. Her house was intact, but there was something that was in thousands of pieces in the backyard, and one could reasonably assume from looking at it that it must have been a boat, okay? And so they're trying to capture this live shot. And so they walk up to the woman, and the reporter puts the mic in, the woman's face, and excuse me, but, we're just seeing how you're doing and what you're assessing. And she's looking, and she's shaking her head, and she's like, well, she goes, oh boy, that was my husband's boat. And they were like, oh my, well, what's it like for you to see your husband's boat like this? And she looked, and she goes, well, he loved that boat. And they said, well, what about you seeing it like this? And she goes, I always hated that boat. You know what I mean? And she goes, I got to be honest with you, I'm glad it's gone. And boy, they cut right back to, News Central. You know what I mean? They're like, back to you, Stan, or whatever, because she had done the reframe. She had thought about it differently. As you think, so you feel. It truly is the most powerful tool that we have in dealing with stress, is our ability to think and to rethink. And sometimes the challenge is to find the silver lining in some of what we've been experiencing. I'm hoping somehow that when we come out on the other side of this, you think about, and I've often said this, tragedies are compounded if you can't take something away. And this is clearly a tragedy. And maybe what it does is it teaches us to be more appreciative of each other. Maybe we learn to appreciate more of this social cohesion when we're able to do it. Maybe somehow that it's, pandemic. Pan meaning Greek for all, demos meaning people. It's involving everybody. The entire world is involved in this. And so maybe somehow we become closer. And so maybe, it allows us to sort of realize that we're collectively all in this together. There's an interesting theory in psychology known as the terror management theory. And it's not meant to deal with terrorism as much as it is meant, it's a social psychological theory, but what it's meant to deal with is what we're afraid of and our biggest fear. And our biggest fear, and if you ask people what their biggest fear is, the fear is we don't know what happens when you die. And so what is really interesting about the terror management theory is this notion that in order for you because in order for you to be right, in your beliefs, somebody else needs to be wrong. And again, I think that there's a natural way to go stronger to your beliefs and what that may be. And so maybe something like this allows us to be more accepting somehow, right, of differences in beliefs, whatever it may happen to be. I don't know. We will see. We will see if there's, something that can come out of this that is, again, to come out on the other side and somehow feel like there's something positive that we can look at and what we can do.
I have
Okay, sure.
one more question, and it may be that you just refer back and say, well, the answer is in what I've already said, but I think we've talked about situations where people are working and trying to deal with that at home, but many are experiencing being laid off. And maybe none of our viewers have, maybe they have, but they may know someone who has, or and that certainly causes a certain amount of stress. And if someone in our family or in our circle of friends has, that too can cause some stress. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and again, it certainly leads to uncertainty, and we don't like the uncertainty. I mean, clearly with what is happening around us, you feel so much for the small business owner, the restaurants. You just really kind of hope these restaurants, when this is all done, they're going to be able to make it because of who they employ and what they're able to do. And I just think that during these times and the layoffs and the uncertainty and when are we getting back, I think the best that we can do is sometimes is not to try to take it away from people. One of the things that I often do is it's okay to feel bad, but just do it on, in a sense, if you can do it on your terms, and to normalize. I would say to somebody who is concerned about their job or feeling laid off, I'd be more surprised if you weren't worried about that. So it's not unusual that you would be experiencing this. And it's just so unsettling. And I go back to, what have you done in the past to handle stressful times? I try to keep people optimistic, forward thinking, to let them know they've handled difficult situations before. And sometimes people will say, I've never dealt with anything like this. And I'll say, maybe you haven't, but you've dealt with difficult times before in difficult situations. What's gotten you through? And if you can keep people somehow present focused, come up with a plan of something that they could possibly do. I think that's some of the best things that we can try during these times, but I don't try to take it away from people. I think that suggesting to people, well, it's not that bad or something like this. No, I'm much more inclined to sort of recognize how uncomfortable it is. Sure.
So this question is about the spiritual dimension or component of stress management. And if there is, how would you describe it, and how can we access and employ it to our benefit?
Yeah, I certainly believe that when people experience a stress response, I often consider it in terms of a social and spiritual aspect to it. And I think that, again, for what I would offer to you is to try to, as much as anything, normalize where people would be regarding that. I've had people at times, question, and I think it's okay to question. It's okay to question, gee, what's going on here? And, should I go stronger to my faith? What do I need to do to be able to do this? And I think that the questions are often good questions, and I think that to normalize that. But there certainly is a spiritual piece to it. I've seen this in the aftermath of crisis situations when some people have a crisis of faith, and that can happen. And again, in my role as a psychologist, I don't necessarily try to talk scriptures or something with them, but what I will do is I will normalize that for them. And then I want to refer them where they will need, where they can find that help. And it's interesting, I'm a member of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, and we teach a lot of different courses. anything from doing group crisis intervention to strategic planning to working in schools. But the one piece that was added was a pastoral crisis intervention course, because for a lot of people, it is that faith-based component that will get them and help them through these super challenging times. One last piece to this is that there was an organization not far from here called ASTT, what was it? The Association of Survivors of Torture and Trauma. And they worked with people from around the world that had experienced different forms of trauma. And I had a student who was able to do a dissertation looking at what helped people be resilient in the midst of what they had gone through. These were people that were seeking asylum, and it was interesting, but two of the biggest factors, social support and faith. And so you can just imagine, and how for a lot of people that's what would get them through. And there's time and time again the research will suggest that. And I think part of it to me is that it provides a sense of purpose, meaning, comfort, and coming to Mass. And this is something else that people aren't experiencing, because one of the benefits of coming to Mass is the social cohesion. You're a part of something, and that is so important for people. And I know with Easter coming up and not being able to do this, and how people are going to feel about that, and the question becomes, what can you do to help foster some of this? Just a super big proponent on how all this can work. And you said there's another question?
So another question, if I understand this correctly, is, let me pull it up here. So just about families, if you have extended family and they're not proximate, and even if they're some kind of physical ailment, you can't be present to them, and God forbid they are stricken by the virus, and you can't be with them. So family who is apart and dealing with that stress of caring for and concern for family members who are not here.
Yeah, and certainly that, to me, speaks directly to the sense of what can you do in a situation like that when you're going to feel out of control, and what can you do to enhance any perception over that type of situation when you're limited regarding what you can do. And so, I mean, I feel, for example, in listening to this, when I'm hearing some of the fear that we have is that the virus spreads into nursing facilities or assisted living facilities for our parents or grandparents, or and not being able to be present and not being able to be a part of this. I know, for example, that I feel for people that are meant to have weddings right around this time, or I have a niece who's giving birth to her first child, and who can be in the delivery room. I mean, all of these things where you feel this sense of wanting, and going back to the notion of parents or loved ones, and you're not able to be there, and what does this entail? Again, I don't know if there's an answer to what you can do, as much as being able just to provide that sense of, it really is. This is horrible, and sometimes people just want to be able to convey that. And I often, in these situations, I will tell people, if I'm listening to it, I'm not trying to fix it, because I can't. There's nothing necessarily that I can do that I can get you to see your loved one. I mean, I can try to problem solve with you. There's something that I can do, but as much as anything, sometimes just to be there, to be supportive, to listen, and to assess as much as anything. What I listen for is I listen to see, is what this person presenting to me, would I expect to hear this, right? If I expect people to say, oh my God, I feel, guilty, or I feel such a loss, or I feel hopeless, absolutely. all of those things would be there. And if I can help in any way to help try to problem solve this or do whatever, then I'm all about that. If I can help people to somehow just think about it a little bit differently, if there's something that I could do just to say, well, maybe have you thought about it this way? And again, sometimes people in that situation, going back to something we said earlier, is that they might not be thinking clearly. That notion of cortical inhibition. And so and to me, to meet people, are they looking at that time for an emotional response to provide support? Do they need good information? What is it that you can possibly do? And it can change over time. And I know that in a situation like that, it is just so challenging and so difficult because we typically don't have these restrictions on what we do. And that becomes, I think, just something that is you talk about the many, many victims of this virus. I think that's one of them. Yeah. Sadly, terribly sadly. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Lady, I really appreciate you being with us this evening. I think you've given us a wealth of information and a wealth of things to think about and to take home, really. I appreciate that. I also appreciate your willingness. When I called you late last week, you were very accommodating to my request to come and be with us tonight. So I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone who's tuned in has benefited from this, and certainly this will be on our Facebook page that you can share with friends at a later time. Just in terms of social cohesion, in response to some of the things you have mentioned, we at the Cathedral have tried to do everything we can do to try and keep that spiritual cohesion of the community through different prayer opportunities. And our communications director, Beth, has put together our RRR, which goes out 3 times a week, just to help people know what's going on and to try and maintain that. And so we're trying to maintain that at this time. So I appreciate your thoughts and comments.
No, my pleasure. And I just will add as well that if anybody wants to reach out to me directly at Loyola, I'm at JLATING at Loyola, LOYOLA.edu.
Great.
And it really is my pleasure. I mean, it's challenging to be in a position where I'm often one to try to respond to situations like this, but the travel's restricted. You know what I mean? And so anything I can try to do to share information or to, just to help mitigate this. And again, we're all in this. So, I'm hoping and praying for all of us to, during these really challenging times, and just know that with resilience, we will come out on the other side.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who joined us this evening. Appreciate your attention. Peace be with you.